From Vimy Ridge to D-Day, Korea to Afghanistan, Canada has punched above its weight in some of the biggest battles and conflicts in the 20th and 21st centuries.
However, this reputation was not born in the trenches of the First World War, but during an obscure colonial war in Africa.
Known as the Boer War, or South African War, it was Canada's first overseas conflict, and it inspired the creation of modern special forces.
The intersection of University Avenue and Queen Street is one of the busiest and best known in Toronto. Thousands of people pass through this area every day. Most will notice the impressive monument here, but I doubt they give it a second thought. Have you ever noticed that monument before?
I have, in passing, walking along Queen Street.
Do you know why it's here?
No.
Have you ever heard of the Boer War?
I have, I think from high school.
Do you know anything about it?
Not really.
Well, it was Canada's first overseas conflict, and that monument is dedicated to the Canadian soldiers who fought in it.
The Boer War erupted in October 1899, pitching the might of the British Empire against a small group of Dutch-descended farmers in southern Africa known as the Boers. At the heart of the conflict was Britain's desire to bring the gold-rich Boer republics under her control. 1899 was a time of empires and global conquest. Around 50% of the world's land mass and population was under European control. While colonisation is regarded as repugnant to us now, Europeans at the time saw it as their divine right and duty. The biggest and most powerful of all these empires was the British Empire. So vast were her territories that it was known as the empire on which the sun never sets. Despite Britain being the undisputed heavyweight in the world arena, her army quickly suffered humiliating defeats against the small Boer forces known as Commandos. The Boers were tough fighters and expert marksmen. Familiar with the terrain, they were highly mobile and equipped with the latest weapons. What was supposed to be a quick and easy victory for Britain turned into 3 years of brutal and bloody warfare. From a Canadian perspective, the Boer War was controversial and divisive from the get-go. Many Canadians had family connections to Britain and believed it their duty to fight for the Empire. Others, however, saw Britain's actions as selfish imperial aggression. In the end, over 7,000 Canadians volunteered to serve during the war. This monument really gives a feel for Canada's connection to Britain and the Empire at the time of the conflict. At the base are 3 bronze figures. The woman seated is Britannia, the traditional symbol of the British Empire. Her hand is pointed south in the direction of South Africa as she's urging the 2 steely-eyed Canadian soldiers flanking her to answer the call to fight for their country and the Empire. On top of the monument's obelisk is the goddess Nike, the goddess of victory. Descending from the heavens, she is ready to lay a crown of victory on Britannia's head. This is indicative of British Empire ideology of the time, the belief that it was Britain's God-given right to rule the world. The Canadian forces received their baptism of fire at the Battle of Paardeberg in February 1900. With the Boers dug in, the Canadians staged a daring night attack that caught the enemy off guard, forcing them to surrender. In the first significant imperial victory of the conflict, Canadian soldiers distinguished themselves as courageous warriors. Following the capture of the Boer capitals in the summer of 1900, they turned to guerrilla warfare. For the next 2 years, Boer commandos conducted devastating hit-and-run raids against British forces and infrastructure, blowing up storage depots and railway lines. The British responded with a ruthless, scorched-earth strategy. Boer farms were destroyed, and their families were herded into concentration camps. Conditions in these camps quickly became atrocious, with over 27,000 dying from disease and malnutrition. The war finally ended in 1902 when the last Boer commandos surrendered. The independent Boer republics were incorporated into what is now South Africa. While the Boer War might seem like an obscure and brutal conflict, epitomizing colonial greed and expansionism in Africa, it had an enormous impact and legacy on subsequent warfare in the 20th and 21st centuries. Following the fall of France in the early days of the Second World War, Britain's regular army was evicted from the continent. To take the fight to Nazi Germany, a new special raiding force conducting hit-and-run raids was created. Named the British Commandos in homage of their former Boer adversaries, they comprised the first modern special forces, its members partaking in some of the most daring operations of the war. Many would go on to form legendary special forces units like the SAS. Like these depicted in Call of Duty 3, they caused havoc behind Nazi lines during the D-Day landings. These sorts of sabotage attacks are a great example of guerrilla warfare. Striking an unsuspecting enemy where it least expects, in the process disrupting vital supplies and instilling fear into its armed forces. No wonder the British adopted the tactics the Boers schooled them in to take on the Nazis. These tactics were also used to great effect by other commando-inspired special forces units in the Allied armies. Since the Second World War, special forces have spawned around the world and are a key component of modern warfare. As for Canada, the Boer War gave birth to an important legacy of international military service. Canadian soldiers would fight on the bloody battlefields of the First World War's Western Front, playing a decisive role in ultimate Allied victory. During the Second World War, Canadians would contribute in almost every major theatre, and following the successful D-Day landings, go on to liberate the Netherlands, saving millions from Nazi occupation and starvation. In the years after the World Wars, Canadians would play a crucial role in the Korean War and subsequent peacekeeping missions around the world. And all this from a war now forgotten, and a monument noticed but not understood.